Y'all ever wonder what further ado would look like? I mean, as always, all I know is you just go to places and it's without further ado. So, and the only other place I've ever even run across the word is Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing. And I watched the play and I couldn't figure out what the do was. So, yeah, I was just warming up the crowd as they do on TV. It's funny how if you do speaking and you get in various places. Several years ago, I was invited to speak at, what's that? It's a university, Johnson University outside of Knoxville. It was originally Johnson Bible College, but they upgraded and became a university and charged a lot more money. It was a Christian denomination kind of Church of Christ sort of place. And I got there and they wanted me to speak, and it was like for the whole convocations. There were like 1,500 people, 2,000, the whole student body's out there. And I'm in my cassock, and some guy on campus for some reason thought they needed to be hear from an Orthodox priest, and invited me in. He was sort of liturgically minded, and believe it or not, some coming from that tradition are kind of into liturgics. And so, and we know liturgics who've come to the right place. But I'm there, and they, the rock and roll band, because they were apparently training their student body for megachurch ministries. And the rock and roll band just was cooking and doing great, and they're singing, and we're swaying and having a great time, and all of that, and it was actually very, very well done. I mean, it's like really great television production. It's amazing how they train them all for that now. And then you get a drum roll or something, a little introduction, and out you walk dressed like this. And and you suddenly look out and you think, this is going to be a tough crowd. I mean, usually those folks look at someone dressed like this and it's like saying sick them to a dog. I mean, they want to check out and find out if you're saved because I don't know what it is about people that when you're dressed in this manner that assume that you are not saved, but there's some of those out on the streets here across the South. But anyway, I come out and I'm looking at them, and my talk was going to be on beauty. I mean, there's sort of a common ground. I like to talk about beauty when I talk to atheists because it's one of the few things we have in common, and I thought, well, I'll start with that with them. But, you've got to do something to crack the ice with them. And so I complimented the beauty of their music because as rock and roll goes, it was very well done. It was really good. And I complimented the music like that. And I told him, I said, you may not credit this, but I once opened for Alice Cooper and the Byrds. And there's a lot of slack-jawed reaction. It's actually true. I mean, and I think, you got to understand, I'm from the 60s. We did it all. But, and that's another long, long story out there. But I won't go into the rest of that. So, I have been working and writing off and on over the last 10 years on a lot of things, but the primary thing that has kept my attention has been on the topic of shame. I've got some personal story involved in that it won't be part of this talk. But it is, Saint Sophrony once said, the way of shame is the way of the Lord. Well, I remember that's the scariest statement I ever read in one of his books, because all I could think of was the shame I got from Baptist preachers when I was a little boy. I mean, it was actually like water off a duck's back, just one more adult yelling at you, and you'd learn to ignore him like you did your mom and daddy, but shaming you. And I discovered, though, in the later life, is that it's not just the way of the Lord, that there is a good shame, a healthy shame, and there is a toxic shame that is in the book of Sirach, in the extra parts of the Old Testament that we read as Orthodox. Chapter 4, it says, there is a shame that leads to sin, and there is a shame that is glory and grace. So all the way back, 3,000 years ago, or 2,500 years ago, a wisdom that understood that shame's not one thing, it's at least two things, and it has a great deal of complexity to it. And I had opportunity in some of that research and stuff to spend time talking with Archimandrite Zacharias at the monastery in Essex, England, because I'd found more in his books and on Sophronia, whose disciple he was. on shame that I found elsewhere. It's in the tradition, deeply in the tradition, although most of the time when you run across shame in the tradition, it's under the heading of humility. Humility being the ability to bear a little shame, as St. Sophrony said, to bear a little shame. Like when you go to confession, you make confession, you bear a little shame when you go to confession, and it's healthy. It's kind of going to a priest, taking off the mask, and talking about who you really are. And it's actually healthy. And we'll touch on some of this, but today what I want to talk about is, the title of it is talking about shame and the language of the liturgy. So we do this all the time. I was telling Judge Lanier that America is a country that is absolutely riddled with shame, but we don't talk about it, and we have very little vocabulary for it. So I hope with this and the talk again tomorrow, and hopefully in this book coming out, to try to increase our vocabulary, an understanding, to be able to talk about it. My first book on Everywhere Present was basically me doing riffs on Father Alexander Schmemann, who talked about sacraments for the life of the world. And this was just my colorful way of trying to talk about the world as a sacramental place. And so this is kind of going inside. But I want to start here with a quote from St. Porphyrius from the book Wounded by Love. If you've not read Wounded by Love, then you should be really excited, because there's a fantastic book you haven't read yet. And that to me is almost one of the best news of any day. So here's a quote. He says, "Whoever wants to become a Christian must first become a poet." That's what it is, he says. You must suffer. You must love and suffer. Suffer for the one you love. Love makes effort for the loved one. She runs all through the night. She stays awake. She stains her feet with blood in order to meet her beloved. She makes sacrifices and disregards all impediments, threats, and difficulties for the sake of the loved one. Love towards Christ is something even higher, infinitely higher. He goes on and says, and when we say love, we don't mean the virtues that we will acquire, but the heart that is pervaded by love towards Christ and others. We need to turn everything in this direction. Do we see a mother with her child in her arms, bending to give the child a kiss, her heart overflowing with emotion? Do we notice how her face lights up as she holds her little angel? These things do not escape a person with love of God. He sees them and is impressed by them, and he says, if only I had those emotions towards my God, towards my Holy Lady and our saints. Look, that's how we must love Christ our God. You desire it, you want it, and with the grace of God, you acquire it. Sweet book. It's a good read. A bit of a long quote. This kind of language can make your heart soar. I mean, it's thrilling. It moves you. And to a certain degree, I'm put in mind of the language in love songs, even rock and roll love songs. Songs say interesting things like, I can't live if living is without you, right? I can't live. I can't give anymore. Can't live if living is without you. I can't give anymore. I mean, we sing and it soars, the melody soars, and I love these things. You're sitting, at the stoplight and you look over in the car, you can't hear them, but they're going, and so, I mean, and all the current contemporary rock and roll songs, and for that matter, most of the country songs, just immediately reach the high-pitched thing and just run it for all it's worth. Run it for all it's worth. But we do that. This language of love. I can't live without you. And you hopefully have found a girl who won't say, well, actually, yes, you can. So it's not entirely true. You can live without her, but you'll be miserable, sad, and lonely. And of course, you can give, but your heart won't be in it. But that's how we sing. But if it's the case that the language of love, the poetry of the heart, doesn't convey facts, it just doesn't convey facts, it's not precisely true, why do we say such things? And why is that language of such use to us? And why would a great saint like Porphyrius, suggests that such poetic language is actually essential to our life as Christians. You know? If someone says something like, "Just the facts, ma'am," and they're a Christian, I assume they're Reformed. I think, forgive me if I step on a toe, but I think sometimes Reform is kind of like what engineers do for theology. It's kind of, you know, I used to say they shouldn't let Germans do theology. It's kind of rigid and stuff like that. I was at Duke with a German exchange student from Bonn, and he knew all of the doctrines of the church in their very encased Latin formulations. He was an amazing guy like that. And kind of hard to talk with in class, but I discovered if we would go out to the little pub that was on campus and get 3 or 4 beers, he was a really wonderful theologian. So that's my thought, is that, you know, Lutherans with a few beers can be lots of fun. So, so can the Orthodox, but for that matter. But if it's not the facts that Porphyrius is talking about, instead looking at this poetic language. So let's take a look at it for a moment from the other side. How do you want your beloved to speak to you? How do you want them to speak to you? I mean, saying, "Just the facts, ma'am," that's a reference to a 1960 TV show. What was that show?
Dragnet.
Yeah, Dragnet with Sergeant Joe Friday. "Just the facts, ma'am." Yeah, the lady answers the door and she's giving him poetry and he wants to hear the facts. You know, "Just the facts, ma'am." How do you want them to speak to you? I mean, part of the humor of the series Star Trek on television and movies or whatever is generated by the non-poetic, non-emotional rationality of Mr. Spock in the early series, and later the non-human android, Commander Data. Both of, I mean, who wants to be wooed by a robot? There's probably a market for it, but I don't even want to talk about that. But I mean, it's just this, what is it like to encounter somebody in which non-emotional language is how they address you? It's just, you know, it's fine, but you don't want, you might want that if you're car shopping or something and you just want to get the facts. But on car shopping, my baby daughter just bought a new car a couple of weeks ago, and she called me up before she went and just would consult with Papa, you know, and I told her, I said, "Darling, it's a seller's market right now. There's no bargaining. You just do your best. Find out what the actual price is, and it's, you know, as little over that as you can pay. That's as good as you'll do." And she said she was going to look, and she thinks she's going to buy a Honda or a Toyota. I said, "You're just fine. You know, I couldn't have told you better myself." But we were talking about the whole thing of going into the car dealer and sweating and trying to bargain with those guys like they don't know what they're doing, you know. And I told her, I said, "I'm a terrible horse trader." I said, "I just always feel like I've been hoodwinked when I go into those places." She said, well, she thought about going in and telling the salesman, "I am going to buy a car today. What I want you to do is tell me something that will make me feel really good about it." I thought, "Darling, you're wise, you know. This is sort of, tell me something to make me feel good about it." She wanted the poetry, and she wanted the poetry of this deal. We don't want to be wooed by a robot, and we don't want to be robots. And though we live in a world where rational work is useful, like writing lines of programming for a computer, which is what my son does for a living, we don't actually want to live that way. You don't want to live that way. My father was an auto mechanic, son of a sharecropper, but an auto mechanic, and no doubt there's a certain amount of drudgery in fixing machines, right? I mean, you undo the nut, put the part on, redo the nut, whatever. But I remember evenings when he came home, or when we were sitting on the porch with my grandfather, who had eventually become an auto mechanic himself after he gave up farming, the two of them sitting around, so both auto mechanics, and the conversation would turn to an interesting problem, like a difficult to diagnose car problem. And their conversation would just change. Something tricky to diagnose, and the solution required a bit of creativity, and those two old mechanics became poets. It was the poetry of the machine. I'll never forget, Beth taught me into buying, it was used, but she taught me into buying a Volvo after we first got married. And I was thinking, my dad, he didn't know nothing about Volvos, and this is a Swedish car, and things, they weren't what they've become, you know. But I brought that thing home, and he looked at me kind of funny. This was not a GM product. And he said Ford stood for fixed or repaired daily. So I, hadn't done much, but brought that thing home, popped the hood, of course. You don't just kick the tires, you go under the hood. He came out from under that really impressed. And I mean, he knew good work when he saw it. He was just very impressed by that. He treated my Volvo with great respect. But they would move into a kind of poetry. And in that kind of time, the drudgery of the job would drop away, and the two mechanics, father and son, would become poets. My grandfather was largely blind in his last years, but a man came from the low state of South Carolina who knew him and took him down to his farm in low state just to listen to some machines on the farm that were having trouble that his mechanics couldn't fix. Papa said, "But I'm blind." And the man said, "Ray, you come down and just listen to him and tell my men what to do." Well, I don't care what you say, there's poetry in that. It goes beyond just the facts somehow. As a little boy, I wanted to be a mechanic, and if I'd probably had my way in life, I would have been. But God had something else in mind. Life is more complicated and exciting than a machine. But we are created in such a manner that even a machine can become poetry to us. This is how we are, how we have been made. In Ephesians 2:10, St. Paul says, "For we are God's poem." It just usually gets translated by some, people who don't bother to keep the Greek. The verse is usually translated, "For we are God's workmanship." Poema can mean workmanship, but I like translating it, "For we are God's poem." Poem. We are God's poem. Little wonder then that Porphyrius would say we must become poets in order to become Christians. You need to be what you really are. You're a poem. St. Gregory of Nyssa said man is a musical composition made by God. And live up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee like I do, which is actually, it's Science City. I mean, we built the A-bomb. We still build some nuclear stuff. We just don't talk about it much. There's a lot of scientists. There's more pocket protectors per capita in Oak Ridge than anywhere in the world. I think most of the city's on the spectrum in some way or other. It's an interesting, I've been there since 1989. First served 9 years as the Episcopal priest in town, then became Orthodox and stayed on in town. So it's been very interesting. But spending time around nuclear physicists, and we've got some. I remember we had a Russian guy come in the 90s because we were bringing Russian physicists in so they wouldn't go to Iran or North Korea, and they found jobs for them. This guy was, I remember my son standing with me, this guy was describing his work he was doing in Novosibirsk before he came, and he was working on moving a particle of, like a photon, from point A to point C without going through point B. And my son said, "That's a transporter beam." And I said, "Yes, son." And he goes, "He has my job." Yeah, they work on all kinds of things out there that that are amazing, but that's sort of poetic too, isn't it? But when you begin working on those levels, or you start talking with scientists of the level of particle physics, there's more poetry involved in that than there is mechanics. And in fact, without an imagination, you can't even begin to understand what they're talking about. It's really kind of interesting how we oftentimes imagine, like on television, imagine science to be when the real thing is much more poetic. But often our efforts at language just fumble about. Some of us get tongue-tied when we try to express ourselves, particularly, say, in the language of love. It's like Cyrano de Bergerac, he's having to write love letters for a friend who can't, just can't express himself to Roxanne. And here's Cyrano having to write his words for him. We get all tangled up. Our hearts long to soar with poetry for those we love, at least to move beyond the language of mere facts and rationality. And there's a block in this effort, and it's that block that actually goes to the heart of that kind of language. It explains why it's difficult, why it's attractive, and actually why it's important to us. And the book of Sirach, as I mentioned earlier, we read, "For there is a shame which brings sin, and there is a shame which is glory and grace." It's a scriptural insight reflected these days in clinical studies on shame. Clinical studies speak of healthy shame and toxic shame. If any of you have read any of the work by Brene Brown, who's sort of a very popular speaker on the topic of shame, for whatever reasons, she's chosen not to use language about healthy shame, and she'll talk about vulnerability and use that in its place. I think she's trying to avoid even using the word shame. I had a couple of my daughters would argue with me when I was trying to tell them what I was doing and what I was writing, and they go, no, Papa, there's no such thing as good shame. It's bad. And I said, yes, there is. And, just quit going all Brene Brown on me and, read my stuff, or let you read some of this clinical stuff. Someone asked me, why do you use that language? I said, because it's the language of clinical studies and it's the language of the tradition. Yeah, it's like, I find it very useful. I've spent, over the last 10 years, I've probably read enough clinical material to have done another master's degree on the topic. There's a lot of stuff out there, and I'm one of those people. I don't want to just talk about it from the emotional level. I want to know what's going on under the dashboard, right? I use the example, I have, for years, 58 years, until I was 58, I was saddled with a terrible anxiety panic disorder. I mean, I white-knuckled my life in a lot of ways. I got through it, I did my job, I did what I was supposed to do, but it wasn't fun. And at times it was hell. And in fact, it was dealing with that and coming through it's how I first kind of got plugged into thinking about shame, because shame can be a great source for anxiety and panic. Helps when you identify it. But to understand anxiety and panic, for instance, it helps to quit chasing the emotional dog because he's just chasing his tail, running around in your head. And it really, to me, was very useful to understand that my body was producing an adrenaline storm. That when something sets you off and initiates anxiety, panic, it is your ancient body, your lizard brain saying, danger, danger, Will Robinson. There's a saber-toothed tiger in the room, run. And there's fight or flight. I don't usually fight tigers. I'm not good at that. So run. And that's what your body's saying, and it's flooding you with adrenaline so you'll have, the strength to lift a piano off your aunt or whatever it is that's happened. You've got all that stuff in your body, and then there's people out there, well-meaning people, YouTube channels and whatever, trying to tell you how to calm your mind, in the middle of an anxiety attack. And I'm thinking, no, you can't calm adrenaline. It's not meant to calm. It's meant to make you crazy and run like crazy. It just turns everybody into Herschel Walker, to use a local image. They, you want to run. I remember after I'd kind of gotten a little bit of deliverance from some of the anxiety stuff, Beth and I were getting ready to fly to England, and we were in the Atlanta airport, obviously, and waiting for our plane to come in, and I could feel just a little tingle going on, and breathing getting a little shallower, and oh crap, I don't need 8 hours of a panic attack on the way to England. But I'd learned enough that instead of going or something, trying to get myself calm, I said to Beth, stay here with the bag. She goes, where you going? And I said, I'll be back. And I just took off kind of at a low trot down the, concourse there. Why? Because adrenaline wants to run. Like it helps to know what your body's doing and pay attention to that. Instead of thinking it's all in your mind's in your body. And your mind does a lot of body things because it was built that way. So it's very useful. So I've tried to spend a lot of time in thinking about shame to discover, what does the body do with shame? Where does it come from? Why does it do that? So the scriptural insight, clinical studies say there is a healthy shame, a shame that's glory and grace. There is a toxic shame, a shame which brings sin, that is brokenness and death. Shame at its deepest level is in fact an experience of the boundaries of the self. On the one hand, it can be described as how I feel about who I am. You know, like if you feel like you're a piece of crap, that's called shame. That's how it is. It's much worse than guilt. Guilt is how I feel about what I did. I can do something about what I did, but if I feel like the problem is who I am, that's way more painful. Way more. You can carry that for a lifetime. And it can just spiral down and down. And it can be accurate or inaccurate, but especially how I feel about how, not just how I feel about how I am, but also how I feel like I'm perceived by others. You know? And so it's a kind of vulnerability, a nakedness. Think about Adam and Eve, it's nakedness. Adam and Eve, after their disobedience in the garden, say that they're naked, and so they hid. And I love that conversation. God said, who told you you were naked? Yeah. And they, you know, in fact, that's a shame question. It's like, basically, who shamed you? Who taught you that? And then he changes the conversation from shame to guilt. And he said, did you eat the thing I told you not to eat? That's a guilt question. And, you know, so and then as they leave the garden, or having to leave the garden, we're told that God gave them garments of skin. I always thought of them as like Flintstone outfits. But God covers them. And there's a theme that will run throughout Scripture of God covering us. So much so that in baptism, we come out naked from the font if you're a baby. Used to do it as adults, but we quit that somewhere around Constantine, I think, and maybe a little later. But Beth said we couldn't do that when I converted. I asked, you know. No. We didn't even have that conversation. I knew that was a non-starter. So anyway, but we come out naked, and what do we say? As many as have put on Christ. And in Greek, it's endia, which means to endue, to put on clothes. As many as have been baptized into Christ have put Christ on like a suit of clothes. We put on the righteousness of Christ. We are robed in righteousness. It covers our nakedness, the nakedness of our shame, the nakedness of our sin that is now, you know, washed, we're clean, we're back in the garden, and God knows we need to be covered, and He covers us. This is, and as I say, there's a theme, everything from the vesting of the priest. You know, I love that. The priest, we're in the altar. Y'all don't get to hear this, but the priest says, you know, my soul shall rejoice in the Lord, for he's putting on his white thing, right? My soul has rejoiced in the Lord, for He's clothed me with a garment of salvation. He's robed me with a robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom, help me, Father, as a bridegroom,
adorns himself with jewels.
You know, as a bride adorns herself with jewels, so my God has adorned me. And I'm just thinking, I'm kind of glad not everybody's watching, because you get up to that point and you kind of reach the climax and suddenly the priest is comparing himself to a bride. And I'm thinking, they already thought that. But anyhow, you know, as a bride adorns herself with jewels, so my God has adorned me. In my book, I've got a chapter on male and female and the dynamics of all of that. And I wrote in there, I've learned this. I had 3 daughters, you know, weddings. It is all about the dress. It is about the dress. And a lot of guys don't know this, but it's about the dress. You know, you could call off the wedding if you could let her wear the dress and lots of people watch her and admire her. It is about the dress. And all I can say is, priest, we love vestments. We love vestments. It is about the dress. And, you know, golly gee, don't I look good? It's just wonderful. I mean, it is. But it's not really just all about the dress. We're all of us all about the dress. You know, there is not just a physical covering we want to do, and we do rightly even pay attention to it. You know, I've actually, it's all about the dress until you marry them. After that, it's all about the shoes. Lord have mercy. I won't go on about that because my wife's here. Oh, about the shoes. But we want to be covered. There's a nakedness. Shame, the period of middle school, what they call middle school these days, is actually one long period of unmitigated shame. The reason is you've got these who've come in there, they don't have an identity yet. They don't know who they are. Everybody in middle school feels bad about who they are. That's just how it is. They feel bad about who they are. So what do? Well, they need to find places to hide. How do they hide? Well, they hide, some of them in groups, in clumps. Great place to hide. You get a group of friends, you want to dress the same, you want to speak the same, you want to listen to the same music, you want to belong. All of those kinds of middle school behaviors are really behaviors that are dictated by trying to get around shame. That's why bullying occurs. Bullying is just shaming somebody. It's not physical, it's emotional. Why does the bully bully? So that he doesn't feel shame. He puts his shame on you. And it's toxic. Who would ever volunteer to go back and relive their middle school years? Who would ever want to do? Oh, that's just being. You know, now I get together with my friends that I was in those years with, and we're ancient geezers, and we get together for class reunions, and people that others would not even have talked to when we were in school are just fine, because basically the thing that binds us together is we're still living. You know, I can remember 10 years out, we got together for high school, and we're suddenly all talking about our jobs, you know, and stuff like that. 20 years out, we're talking about our kids. Now we're just talking about our operations and, you know, and things like that, and just glad to see each other. And it's funny, just all of the false stuff that guided us as middle schoolers has disappeared. Someone asked me, I was talking about this last weekend out in Colorado, someone asked me, did I think we ever quite get over the middle school experience? And I said, no, my years as a parish priest have often felt like a middle school principal. Kind of depending on how dysfunctional at any given time a parish community might be. Because the wounds that we had then, we don't have a way in our culture to signal that you've left that behind. Sometimes people have to move away to get an identity that wasn't invented by some very hurtful people around them as kids. And they go away and they come back and, my God, they're competent. They always were, just no one would let them be. Things that way. Interesting dynamics that go along through this, and it carries in our years. The toxic stuff, unresolved toxic shame, like from trauma and abuse, which is far more common in our culture. We talk about it. Sometimes it surfaces and you'd even forgotten you had it. You'd forgotten the actions that caused it, but your body remembers. Your body keeps score, and it remembers, and it can resurface these things. Things can do it. You know, I get this in the church. We'll have inquirers come in, and there's some people who come in to visit an Orthodox church, and suddenly there's this wall, and there's icons on it, and you can't go behind there. And I get people who get angry about that sometimes. They can't go there. You know, America, we have a deep, deep democratic spirit, and that's also born of a deep sense that nobody's better than I am. You know, it's like you're still reacting to the 1600s or something, but nobody's better than me. We all know everything. Lord have mercy. We all know everything. We're experts in epidemiology. We're experts now in geopolitics. We know everything. We've all been experts in economics for years, and everybody's got an opinion and all of that stuff going on. But, oh Lord have mercy. But they come in, and suddenly there's, Orthodoxy shot through with hierarchy. No, you can't go in there. And they say, why can't I go in there? I said, because it's holy. And, well, why can you go in there? Because I've been set aside to go in there and risk getting killed for doing it. Read your Old Testament. Right? They used to in the Old Testament, they tied a rope around the priest's ankle in case God killed him so they could drag him back out because they couldn't go in and get him. I would think about that every so often. But I tell them, in Orthodoxy, we hide stuff so that we can unhide it. We hide stuff so we can reveal it. Orthodoxy is apocalyptic. Apocalypse doesn't mean the book of Revelation. It means revelation, which means to reveal. The holier something is in Orthodoxy, the more we hide it. And with the thing we hide in the altar, we hide it so that at a certain moment we finally open the curtains, open the doors, bring it out and stick it in your mouth. You know? But you didn't know it was holy, you know, until we put a wall around it. We started our mission in Knoxville. We were meeting in a warehouse, and finally, you know, a couple of weeks of that, everybody decided we need an iconostas. It was 25 feet wide, our little warehouse space. So we went over to Lowe's or Home Depot, one of those places, and got us some lumber and drywall. And we came back and we built a 25-foot wide iconostas we had a drywall with 3 doors in it. Our iconostas is still 25 feet wide, and the reason is because that's the size the warehouse was originally. Long story that. But we built that thing with 3 doors, and the thing that had been, the little table that had been sitting up front, I was a layman. I'd left my Episcopal priesthood and was chrismated the next week by Vladika Dimitri's orders and immediately appointed to be as the lay pastor starting the mission in Knoxville. So wet behind the ears. The liturgical learning curve was vertical, totally. But so the little table I was using to hold my book and kind of preside at wound up on the altar side of the altar, and we're standing out there, and I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, the iconostas reveals that table to be an altar. Before the iconostas was built, it was just a table up front to hold my book. When the iconostas is built and it's on the other side of it, it becomes an altar. Now I'm thinking, oh dear, can I touch it? What do you do? And, you know, they later, after 9 months, they made me a deacon, but they didn't ordain me priest for another 4 months. I spent like 4 months as a deacon thinking, wait a minute, there's not a priest to bless me to put my vestments on. Can I, I had to call and say, can I do this? Yes, yes, yes. Dispense with it, put your vestment. But there's actually not a service for a deacon to do by himself. The earliest days of after Father Thomas had left here with the starting of St. Innocents, you had Father Inocente, who was a deacon, Belarus. I knew Father, and I came down here and baptized 2 Russian twins. I don't know if that family is still members, but because that would have been in the first months of my priesthood in '99. It was we were meeting in the chapel at the Episcopal Church, and I was taking directions from that deacon. But it's good because he knew what he was doing and I didn't. Father Inocente always knew what he was doing. And usually would quote good holy sources for me. My abbot back home. But these things, we hide them. There is a dynamic of shame that is occurring in this. I mean, to hide something kind of obscures the shame. To reveal something creates an intimacy. Shame, as I said, forms boundaries. When you meet somebody for the first time, and let's say it's somebody important, you know, how do you feel? Probably a little awkward. Like, how do I do this? Do we shake hands? Do we hug? What is it? You know, that was more complicated last year. Hello. Whatever was going on that way. You know, it's shame that's going on. In fact, they call shame the master emotion, as the other emotions check in with shame to find out if it's okay to express themselves. And so you have 2 Englishmen trying to say something important who feel entirely awkward and can't quite get it out. As John Cleese of Monty Python fame said, if you've ever apologized to a piece of furniture, you might be English. And I've explained to our newcomers who come in and want to know, why do we kiss icons? I said, because Jesus started with Greeks and Jews. And Greeks and Jews kiss everything. If Jesus had started in England, we would have icons, but instead of kissing them, we would simply feel awkward and apologize. That's how it'd be. And so so part of this is like they come in and everybody's kissing an icon, and we're revealing their uptight Englishness that we've inherited over here, especially in the South, and they just feel kind of awkward about it. And I'm thinking, it's actually revealing you. And you've got little boundaries going, we don't kiss objects, or something like that. Or even the really dark Calvinist one in your mind, idolatry, which is really just an excuse of, I don't want to kiss it, But it's, we have these little shames. As I said, it informs us about boundaries. And as such, it's healthy. It's nice to know there's a boundary. If you meet somebody whose shame thing isn't functioning, and there are people who, for various reasons, are, handicapped, and it doesn't work, and so they're socially awkward. Generally, when we say that somebody's socially awkward, it's because their shame thing's not functioning well, and it's not telling them, don't do that, right? And everybody kind of backs off and has to deal with it. But these things, in a healthy sense, are important. And actually, this is John Bradshaw, one of the great researchers in shame, said that shame is essential to the experience of worship. The experience of wonder and awe is a subcategory of healthy shame. It is, it's like Rudolf Otto, one of the great German theologians, early 20th century, his book, The Idea of the Holy. And he analyzes that. And he said it's the experience of the ganz anders, the holy other, that you come in and that, the first thing you need to know about God is you're not Him. And you get this. You go into, say, some great cathedral in Europe and you're visiting. You ain't Catholic or anything like that. You walk into the cathedral and suddenly your voice drops to a whisper. And you act in a different manner. What's going on? You've just crossed a boundary. And it is holy. You have a sense of that, and awe and wonder begin to come. It's necessary to the human heart. We were created this way. Babies, even infants, have a hardwired reaction, an affect as it's called, for shame. The most common way you'll see this is a mother has a young baby, maybe 4 or 5 months, in her arms, and brings them up. It's going to say hello to you and want to show off the baby, and the baby does what? Buries its face in her chest, won't look at you. And then if it's a real insistent mother, she'll torture the baby until he cries, trying to make him look at you. I get this at communion. Bring the baby up to communion and suddenly sees big beard priest coming in face with spoon. And you get, ah! Shame moves to the affect of distress. And I've played around with this some, Father. And I've actually, because it's face-to-face provokes shame. That makes you want to hide. And I've actually, in a couple of cases, learned to give communion out of my peripheral vision. It's easier. And then they get used to it and they'll eventually look at you. But this sort of, or if you're greeting someone and they've got little children and they're trying to usher them into the scary black robe band and they're wanting to hide, they'll kind of turn around and bury their face in Mama's dress or something. And then if she tries to, because that embarrasses Mama, because the children aren't doing what she wants them to, and then they try to make them do that. I tell them, don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, they're telling you, I feel vulnerable. Don't violate somebody's vulnerability. Wait till I've done a few jokes and stuff, they'll warm up to me. I'm a grandpa. I know how to do this, but don't just sort of shove them at me. It's like I do in hearing children's confessions. I told them, I do not forgive me if I step on your toes or not, but I never did classes on sin for kids to prepare them for confession. I thought, oh, they're experts. They don't need me teaching them about sin. I just told parents, all I want them to do is to come and be comfortable with me for early confessions, like age 7, age 8. Just come, be comfortable, and we'll just sit and talk, just the two of us. I'll get enough out of that, and I'll put the stole in their head and we'll pray. As they age, and I'm assuming they're going to be at church, they start hitting around 10 or 11, there's some stuff. When they really need me, and they're like 12 and 13, and they're suffering middle school, and all of that, I want them to know they can come to me. I just want them to feel safe. That's all I need. God will take care of the rest. They need to be able to come to confession. They need to be able to come and bring their shame. And the last thing they need is a preparation on the kind of things you need to tell a priest. And I hear a lot of my Catholic buddies talking about how I used to go to the priest and lie, just because they didn't have any good sins, and so they'd make up some things, and but you don't need that. You just need, it's relational, and what you want, shame, one of the main things it wants for its healing is it wants safety, where it can share itself and come into the light. If you go to therapy and are dealing with shame issues, pretty much that's what you're going to get, is hopefully a therapist you really trust, feel safe with, and can begin to bring it in the light. There's techniques like EMDR that are really good for treating trauma and things like that. Stuff that sort of evolved as we're learning to treat soldiers with PTSD, because this stuff is really trauma, the toxic stuff. But the other is like learning to give a little room for it. It's okay. It's okay. Let children be children. Don't try to turn them into little adults. They've got emotions and they will tell you what they are, and pay attention to them, because their emotions are just as valid as yours. They just are. Sometimes if a child says they don't want to do something, it can be an interesting exercise to ask them why. You would do the same for your wife. Why not? Now, they may have no good reason, and you just need to, get them to do it anyway. But sometimes treat them like human beings. So it's a boundary of the self. But in this difference between healthy shame and toxic shame, healthy shame wants to hide, is capable, though, of pulling back the curtain and revealing itself. It's capable of being naked and bearing the shame that comes with it. Toxic shame, that's often the result of abuse of any sort, doesn't just want to hide. It wants to dig a hole in the ground and completely disappear. It just wants that to be gone. Toxic shame creates all kinds of strategies to disguise itself, to relieve the pain, to protect us from what is probably the worst pain anyone can have in this life. Interesting interviews with soldiers going into battle. I don't know about you, but my first thought about going into battle is I don't want to get shot. Or blown up. That seems pretty practical. The number one fear that soldiers described, though, about going into battle was the fear that they would crack under the pressure and run. They were more afraid of shame than of dying. More afraid of shame than of dying. And I would generally say that's true for human beings. More afraid of shame than of dying. Worse yet, dying while shamed. It's just really awful. So most of the poetic language that we engage in is actually to pull back the curtain to some small degree and reveal the truth of our hearts. The wonder of the soul, the naked truth of our existence. How many movies have been built turning on the fact that he's having a difficult time telling her that he loves her? You can get an entire plot out of that, and many have, just pulling back the curtain and actually saying this vulnerability that means suddenly, I not only love you, but I want to be with you. I want you to be mine. All of that. What if she says no? Mr. Darcy got told no the first time. Andy had it coming to him. But yes, I have watched all of those movies and memorized them. I said I had 3 daughters and a wife, so all of this language effort of this language of poetry tries to reveal these hidden things, the naked truth of our existence. We cannot love each other from behind a mask. And if I'd have said that a year ago, that would have set off a political discussion. But little wonder there were so many complaints during the pandemic. You do need to see faces. We may have needed health and whatever benefits there were, and they'll keep debating that forever and a day. But things were missing. I need human beings, the emotions are registered. All of the emotions are primarily registered in the face. I can't read your blood pressure. You know, I can't read your adrenaline flow. I can't read your brain, but I can read your face. Even a dog can read your face. It's the only animal that exists that can read a human's emotions, which is one of the reasons we like them so much. They've evolved alongside us, and they can read a human being. They're amazing dogs. I love them. But, you know, we need to be able to do that. I mean, the highest thing the Scripture can say to us about our goal in relationship to God is that we will see Him face to face. It even describes our movements from glory to glory as God is revealed to us in the face of Jesus Christ. And so icons, rightly painted, always give us the face. You may, under certain kinds of circumstances in an icon, paint it with a 1/4 turn, particularly if it's like on iconostas and it's 1/4 turned towards Christ, but you still get the full face. I'm afraid I was in a church just recently, and a lot of the images of saints and stuff in their wall frescoes were profile. And it's actually a no-no in traditional iconography. I mean, Judas and demons are painted in profile. If you will, their personhood has been hidden and defaced. But to see someone is to see them face to face. And so we do that in the icon. And of course, we are all icons. In the opening quote from St. Porphyrius, he observes, "Do we see a mother with her child in her arms, bending to give the child a kiss, her heart overflowing with emotion? Do we notice how her face lights up and she holds her little angel?" In doing research on the topic of shame for this book I noted that clinical writers describe the face-to-face encounter between mother and nursing child. I ran across this in a book by a secular Jewish psychiatrist, a clinical book on shame, and he described it as communion. I thought, whoa, I know about communion, and I was surprised, but I think there was no other word to describe what was taking place between mother and child. You could describe the experience in medical terms. Here is a quote from WebMD on your internet thingy. It says, "When you breastfeed, your body makes the hormones prolactin and oxytocin. Oxytocin produces a peaceful, nurturing feeling that allows you to relax and focus on your child. It also promotes a strong sense of love and attachment between you and your baby." Well, that's just great, but that's just not how a nursing mother talks, you know. And, oh, sweetie pie, you just make me flood with oxytocin. I tell you, you know, and it's just, oh, when I'm with you holding your hand, the dopamine just flows. I mean, we don't talk like that, but this bond between mother and child in nursing. I thought about this when I was reading it and thinking about the Theotokos in Jesus, Mary and the child Jesus, who nurses him, probably at least 2.5, maybe 3, who knows how long they went. But how many times a day? You know, probably nursing on demand because the child is God. And but who's going to say no? But I mean, but that every time, that many times a day, she looks God in the face, and He looks back at her as a mother and child look at one another. There is a bond and a communion. And I just think my Protestant friends have no clue. They have no clue to this woman, who she is and what she is and what she knows, what she knew. That communion bond never broke. It never broke. At the cross, it had not broken, and she stands there. And it's in Jesus, among His last words to John, "Behold your mother. Mother, behold your son." He's looking after his mother, the last thing. Even the wedding at Cana, which is often badly treated, and people say Jesus says to her when she comes to him and says they have no wine, Jesus is translated as saying, what's that do? I mean, woman, you know, what have I to do with you? You know, and the Protestants say, see, Jesus is dissing his own mama. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. He's actually quoting from one of the Book of Kings, where the encounter between the prophet Elisha, one of those guys, never can keep them straight, talking to the widow whose son has died. He's going to raise him from the dead, but the widow whose son has died. And this phrase, she says it to him. It's a very weird Greek phrase that, in fact, it's very hard to know how to translate. If you read the Greek Old Testament, you'd know that Jesus was quoting the Old Testament when he said this. It's sort of like, what is this between me and you? It's a very strange little phrase. It's not rude at all. But woman, because she is the new Eve, she is woman. It's not a term of disrespect any more than son of man is disrespect for Christ. Woman, what is this between me and you? And says, my hour hasn't come. This is Jesus saying to his mother, we don't have to do this now. We don't have to do this now. Because you know, as I know, that if I do this, then it all begins. And you will become the widow of a dead son. This is where you and I know it is heading. She's already a widow. You'll become, he quotes this, of the widow's complaint. What is this between us? And some have, in the fathers, have described this as the second annunciation. The first time the angel announces the incarnation, and she says, be it done unto me according to thy word. And this second encounter where Jesus says, we don't have to do this, but it's not my time. She turns, and this is the second yes, do whatever he tells you. It is her saying to Jesus, I'm ready. You know, let's do this thing. Do whatever you want. If you're ready, I'm ready. This is her second yes. And it has to be. She has to say yes to this before it can be done, because the sword will pierce her own soul also. Just as his sacrifice on the cross is voluntary, so her sacrifice with him on the cross must be voluntary as well. She couldn't have seen all of that in the original yes to Gabriel. But she has come to see it as she knows him and who knows what conversations they have had. And it's finally, do whatever he says. She's ready to do it. And she never leaves him. That is, and this communion began between the eyes of mother and child. It's interesting, this intense experience of union between mother and child, face to face, a bond that normally, in normal things, creates emotional stability in a child, a sense of safety, right? I mean, a baby gets upset, what do? Well, you grab them and nurse them. You do what you can do, you know. The husband says, here. Why? No can do. Anyway, you know, it's an intense experience. It is in many ways a baseline reality in normative human experience. We don't all get normative, but it's a baseline reality that we long for actually throughout the whole of our lives. It's the poetry of our existence. In Psalm 131 we read, surely I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. Not until 1970 would a psychologist come up and begin talking about the inner child. The psalmist, writing in 1000 BC, already knows it. My soul is like a weaned child. You ever notice the icons of the death of the Theotokos? Jesus is holding a little child in his arms, in swaddling cloths, no less. It's Mary, but he's pictured as a child. And it's interesting that the soul, most often in iconography, that little bit of times you'll find a soul, they're pictured as a little child. I have quieted my soul as a little child within me. And the more I've served as a priest and heard confessions and done pastoral things with people, you've got a little child in you. That's mostly who you are. You still want your mother. And it's one of the things I discovered in becoming Orthodox is I got my mother. I was an Anglican, a high church Anglican who said my rosary and did all the things I could, but you never could feel comfortable in church because there was, you know, low church piranhas out there. And if they caught you liking Mary too much, they'd eat you. And it was a danger. It was a kind of a danger. I mean, you know, there were high church pockets here and there where you could go and do that. But here across the South, this was low church country. And, you know, the first church I served in, it officially said St. Mark's, but I knew it was Mr. Mark's. And, you know, They had a stained glass window, and in the top of it, they had the symbol of St. Timothy, which included a mitre originally. They said, get that popish image out of there, and they replaced it with just a plain piece of glass and took the mitre out, Mr. Timothy's. But anyway, become Orthodox. And here she is. I mean, Catholics don't ever even dream of talking to Mary as much as we do. We mention her all the time. Everything we do is in communion with her, you know. committing ourselves and one another, not our life into Christ our God, but we do it with her. She's there. You don't understand who Jesus is if you don't mention her. You might not understand how fully human he is if you don't mention her. This is just part of the dogma and life of the church. But she is, I know not long, a couple of years after I'd converted, I ran into one of my Anglican buddies and he said, "You ever think of going back?" My first thought I said to him was, "And leave my mother?" He didn't know what I meant. Now, I was blessed that my earthly mother and father became Orthodox at age 79, some 6 or 7 years after I'd converted. And the Episcopalians drove them in here. And they became very, very happy Orthodox and were buried from the church. But surely I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. There's a reason that children up to a certain age tend to run to their mothers for comfort. The experience can wane through the years, though there are haunting tales from battlefields of wounded, dying soldiers crying out for mama. The child longs to be comforted, and the comfort we desire is nothing other than communion, a union that is safe, that is secure, that affirms our existence, that assures us that we are well, and all things will be well, and above all else, that we are loved. The union of man and woman in marriage that we enter into, one of the two greatest examples of such communion. Marriage only begins with a sacrament as it's celebrated. It moves from there through a process of years, sometimes fitfully. The union we experience is a journey towards communion, towards a union where we are increasingly able to share of our inmost self, to reveal the truth of who we are, and to see that truth reflected back to us in the eyes of the beloved. In marriage, we come to know ourselves as we see ourselves in the other. And the truth is, we never know ourselves by looking at ourselves. Mirrors are useless. I mean, they kind of get your hair right. But St. Gregory of Nyssa said the soul is a mirror. The soul is a mirror. But it's not a mirror for us to look at and see ourselves. It's not that kind of mirror. The soul is a mirror of Christ. We begin to see Christ in the mirror of the soul, and in seeing Him, we see ourselves. As 1 John 3 says, "Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is." Christ reflected in the mirror of the soul, and seeing Him face to face, I will be like Him. I will see the truth of my existence, that I was always created to be like Him. I think this describes the journey of marriage as well. We marry, what and who we shall be has not yet appeared. When I got married, I had no idea what I was doing, and neither did she. Lord knows she didn't. You always, no matter what you think, you always marry a stranger. You always marry a stranger. In time, perhaps over a lifetime, we begin to see the other as they truly are, and in that seeing, we also see ourselves as well, seeing ourselves as we truly are. This is the great intimacy, I mean, of which our physical nakedness with one another is at best an icon, but an image. It's the nakedness of the heart we share with each other. Now, of course, as marriages get broken or just damaged, we oftentimes, I mean, the worst thing couples can do, is shame each other. And what happens then is the other person begins to build walls and armor. You can't hug each other well while you're wearing armor. It's being able to, and that's, in other words, and it's got to be safe. You can't abuse the intimate knowledge we have of one another. You have to, love has to be a safe place. And look, I've been married for 46 years. Sometimes I've gotten this right, and probably more times than not, I got it wrong. I'm just like you. I think it's healthy that our priests are mostly married, because there's almost nothing else where you can learn and practice this sort of intimacy. I think it's very difficult for monks to get this. They just don't. I do. I think the married life, despite the fact that our tradition honors monasticism as much as it does, I think the married life is far more normative and much more the school of healing and wholeness. So as we confront Christ, we begin to do what lovers do. We slowly begin to speak in the poetry of the heart. I love you is a simple phrase. It's also inadequate, including in marriage. It's not enough. In the language of the liturgy, we are taught by saints. I'm finally getting around to the title of this talk. I'm almost done. They were sitting on the edge of their seats saying, when's he going to talk about the liturgy? But as we cut, in the language of the liturgy, we're taught by the saints in the language of the heart. It's a language in which we do not hide our shame, our deepest vulnerabilities, our most revealing self-descriptions, as giving voice to the deepest desires of our heart. I believe and I confess, O Lord, that you are truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, who came us into the world to save sinners, of whom I am first. That covered it. Of whom I am first. Or how shall I, who am unworthy, enter into the splendor of your saints? If I dare to enter into the bridal chamber, my clothing will accuse me, since it's not a wedding garment. We're in the close again. Being bound up, I will be cast out by the angels. In your love, Lord, cleanse my soul and save me. We bring this. Now, it's not just written by poets. These saints are poets. They're Greek poets. Okay? And Greek poetry, especially Byzantine Greek poetry, is over the top. They're just over the top. It's just how they are. They're Mediterraneans. First off, they are not English. If you ever want to see the difference, read the history of the English church written by the Venerable Bede in the 700s, first kind of history of the English. It is completely, the guy's an Anglo-Saxon, right? A real live Anglo-Saxon, but by comparison to anything of any century you read by the Greeks, it's extremely reticent and careful. If he tells you a miracle, he will document it along with the eyewitnesses. It's just like an English court of law. But, and the Greeks are Mediterranean, wonderfully stuff. Loving Master, Lord Jesus Christ, my God, do not let these holy gifts be to my condemnation because of my unworthiness. Now, we sometimes come to the church and we hear this language, and if someone is not used to it, we hear it as like shaming us. You are unworthy. How dare you come? You don't have a wedding garment. Yada, yada, yada. It's like, and they're just, and if you've got toxic shame wounds, it's hard language to hear. When I was in seminary, back in my Anglican days, there was a prayer called the prayer of humble access. We do not presume to come to this thy table, O merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We're not worthy so much to gather up the crumbs under thy table. This could be Orthodox, and so on it goes. But when I was in seminary, they used to make fun of it, and they called it groveling. It sounded like something out of Monty Python. I hate it when you grovel. This big face of God would appear in the clouds. Quit groveling, And, that would be like someone appearing, you're trying to woo some young maiden and whispering sweet, things in her ears, and suddenly this big face appears and says, oh, shut up, you don't mean it. That's, yes, we do mean it, but the poetry comes hard for us. The language of the liturgy is a language of love. I wrote an article about this some years back called the erotic language of prayer, because it is. It's a very naughty, erotic language. This is stuff like Song of Songs. That's a rich book. And it's how we approach God, more intimate than you would ever have with another human being, right? And the liturgy tries to take us there. We have to learn to adjust our ear to it. A couple of paragraphs to finish out. It's important to understand the true poetic nature of these prayers. They're all there. These are not the words of Mr. Spock or Commander Data. They're not robot words trying to objectively relate the condition of our souls. So say, many, if they've come from a religious background that is heavy with toxic shame, like, heavy original sin stuff, right? Or if they carry a burden of toxic shame from other places, to say, my clothing will accuse me, and then being bound up, I'll be cast up. Angels can be tantamount. The old Protestant saw that said that we're nothing more than a snow-covered dunghill. I hated that phrase. Or a massa damnata, that is just a damned lump. A lump of damnation, rotten to the core and evil. That is not the Orthodox faith. The Orthodox faith says you are good. You are created good by God. Your essence is good. Your nature is good. Our problem, what makes us sinful, is that we don't live in accordance with our nature. We fail to be truly what we're created to be. But you are good. You are good. In fact, if the human race weren't as good as it is, we'd have killed ourselves off long ago. It's not the mystery of evil that's the great thing to ponder. It's the mystery of goodness. Evil's usually pretty darned easy to explain. You know, somebody hurt me, so I hurt you. That's just pretty straightforward. It's the sacrificial goodness, you know, of some guy, you know, rushing into a burning building at the risk of his own life to save a dog. It happens. It's real. Where does that goodness come from? We were created that way. There could never be healing. There could never be forgiveness. There could never be all the many things we have that have saved us from utter destruction had we not already always had this pool of goodness. And God sees this. He always sees this. And He loves us. This is our affirmation as Orthodox Christians, and one of the things that makes us different from the others. And the Western tradition that was so nurtured in this kind of total depravity stuff. No, you're good. You're good. You know, and you ought to treat your children like they're good. Man, Beth was reading me about a cult yesterday. It was all about beating children. It came from Tennessee. But, you know, they're evil. If you don't beat them, they won't be good. These boys, that not work that way. That's just backwards. It's just backwards. So the point isn't information. The point, like what robots give, the point is in the heart, and language is but a tool in our efforts to speak from the heart and to reveal ourselves to God. It's not you trying to say, I am not worthy, I'm groveling and I'm laying on the floor and drag me to communion or something. This is it's simply saying, oh God, I am naked. Look at me. Look at my face. I'm naked. You know me. You know me. Peter and Jesus on the shore of Galilee. Peter, do you love me? Oh, how the words had to sting after having denied Him 3 times. Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know I love you. And He uses a softer word. He can't use the agape word. Peter, do you love me? And finally, in his frustration at the 3rd question, Lord, you know I love you. This is Peter saying, Jesus, I'm naked. In fact, he jumped out of the boat naked, it says. He didn't put any clothes on. They were out fishing. Basically, he's in a little loincloth. He jumps out of the boat in his loincloth. He goes running to Jesus. He's just naked. Lord, you know me. You know me. That was the day he became a rock. Not all the other times when he talked big, but that day when he became naked before Christ and said, you know me, that day he became Peter. And you and I, in this dance of the liturgy we do week in and week out, the dance we do in confession, the dance we do in our relationships, distant until closer and the more intimate, are doing the same, slowly pulling back the curtain, being what Adam and Eve had run away from, to bear the intimacy of our soul, to bear, as St. Sophronius said, a little shame, that we might have the glory and grace that Sirach speaks about, that comes from an intimate union, true communion, that I see you, you see me, I know you, and you know me, and all other things have passed away. All other things have passed away. Why do we forgive each other to begin Lent? So that we can, little by little, begin to be who we are. Be who we are. So, thank you for having me down here. And this is the end of the talk here. If there's time for anything Q&As, Father, I'm good.
Yeah,
so, thank you.
Just to encourage everybody to ask many questions. We have till 5 o'clock. If anything has struck your interest, please ask away. Do you want me up there to point these down, or are you good?
I'll try it. Okay. I can see from here. Yes.
The line in Psalm 50 that says, I was conceived in iniquities and sins that my mother bore me. That's the obvious one to...
Yeah, it is. And I mean, traditionally, a lot of the fathers treat that, is like we say, you know, about human beings, that we're not born as sinners. I mean, we're born innocent. There are some of the prayers of the church, particularly prayers for the burial of an infant, the litany in the OCA at the burial of an infant does not say, for all have sinned, for no one is righteous. And we don't talk like that about infants. Rather, it is the world into which we are born. We are all conceived in a world in which iniquity has its way. So it's not that somehow another, it's certainly not, as St. Augustine said, there's nowhere in our tradition that teaches this, that the act of making a baby is sinful. I mean, there was a kind of a Catholic teaching once upon a time, they keep changing, so I don't know, but a kind of a Catholic teaching that the very act of conceiving a child was concupiscence. The body is not sinful. The desires of the body are not sinful. All the desires of the body can be used in a sinful way, but they're not inherently sinful. That is not who we are. That's kind of been a really nasty little side road of Christianity that it has a pretty bad history, frankly. But that's how I see that, in sin she conceived me, I mean, the other side of it is it really comes down to, it's like I'm a human being, my wife's a human being, we bring our crap with us. It's like we've got a relationship with her, but in the first place I've got to say, forgive me is constantly in that relationship, because I'm bringing all kinds of stuff. I grew up with a family with an alcoholic father in my childhood, and a lot of crazy things went on, and we had to spend some time in the course of our marriage trying to get me sane. So I didn't just do that. So, those were, it wasn't because they conceived me, it's because they were Jim and Nancy and kind of broken. Yeah.
You mentioned the shame language and poetry language that we use in the services, in the liturgy, and you mentioned toxic shame.
Yep.
Is there any way for us, in and of ourselves, or to be able to make a the distinction in our own hearts as to whether our response to the language of the liturgy is flaming the passion of toxic shame, or is actually somehow just healthy shame?
I think take a look at your reactions. There's been times that I just because of what was going on inside me, that was like a kind of toxic time going on, but I just couldn't use a prayer book. I mean, I can do the liturgy because I got to do the liturgy, but I mean, like in my prayers, I just didn't do that. And I had a time once in college. I was hospitalized with a depression for a week in my sophomore year. It was a bad time, and I'd been living in a commune before I went to college, so I had a lot of kind of weird stuff going on. It's the 60s, and I was trying to get kind of detoxed, really, and coming out of that. And at a certain point, I mean, one of the problems about being in a charismatic house church and a commune is it's just a little intense and not always healthy. But I just remember at one point saying, God, I know you're there and I care about all of this, but if you don't mind, I just want to think about you for a few months. It makes my hair hurt. And it's not doing me any good. I couldn't figure it out. I had too many unanswered questions. And I just put God on a shelf. And that's when I kind of left the house church and went back to the Episcopal church, because I knew if I went there, no one would ask me about God. It's actually true. I could go and get communion and they'd leave me alone. And that's what I wanted. I went to like the early Mass, an 8 o'clock service, and they didn't talk. They had to hurry up to their golf game. So they left me alone. And I liked it. I needed that. And so sometimes it could be that, it's like if you find this stuff wounding you, or you're just taking your mind off somewhere like that, I always tell people when things like this happen, put it on a shelf. It's okay. First off, God loves you. He keep telling us that. He's a good God and He loves mankind. He's on your side. He is not trying to crush you. He's not even trying to make this hard for you. He is for you. Now, you can get this drilled in you that if it's not hard, it won't be good. Just like when I was a kid, if it was medicine, it had to taste bad. That's where the phrase "take your medicine" came from, because medicine was awful. Nowadays, somebody got a good idea that it should taste better. You can get it in the kid's mouth easier, but back then, we wanted to hurt children. because we had been hurt when we were children. We wanted to return the favor. So I think, and sometimes there's these things, and it's good to talk about them in confession, especially, if you have, time in a confession that's more than the usual, to talk about these things. I mean, first off, boy, when we get tied up in thinking about feeling right about stuff, it's just really messy. It's like you're not going to feel right about a lot of stuff. You're broken. Your emotions are broken. We don't get this right a lot. It's okay. God is with you. He loves you, and He's working on you. Just relax. It's okay. Go to confession, give Him thanks. But so it just sort of depends. You may sometimes just have to kind of take it easy, or your mind zones out during that part of the liturgy or whatever. But it's, as I say, in our private prayers, it's easy. I usually try to tell people, do not confuse God with your neurosis. You can get neurotic. Like, I've got to do my prayer rule. Haven't actually bared your heart to God at all, but you read through the prayers. How's that any good? But somewhere in somebody's book, it read you got to do the prayer rule whether you like it or not. Well, after a while, that's just going to be not really good idea. I hate to say it, but that's just true. It can just become a chore and hateful and bothersome, like cleaning your room or something. It's just, talk to God. Talk to God. Even if it's saying to God, I really don't want to do this today. God says, how's it going? I mean, what the point is, be naked before God. Be who you are. Be who you are. When we lost a child, our 5th child. Beth was about 6 months in pregnancy or so. We lost a child, and I buried him. And that week at my Episcopal church, I had 3 other funerals that week after burying my son. I remember getting my old wingtips to put on for the next funeral thing, and I picked them up, and they still had wet mud on them from my son's grave. And I threw them across the room, yelled at God, and complained, the mud of my son's grave's not even dry on my shoes, and I've got to go out and bury somebody else, and I'm just mad as hell. And God got me through the week. But I needed to yell at God. He doesn't get, what kind of a God? He's God, y'all. He doesn't get upset about this stuff. Watch how Moses talks to him. Watch how Abraham talks to him. They're real. They were called friends of God. I mean, God's going to go do Sodom. And He said, shall I not tell Abraham, my friend, what I've got planned? I need to go down and visit Abraham. And Abraham talks him down, kind of works some stuff there. So I think it's a very broad question. I think it's good to be aware a little bit. I'm hoping in writing this book to give a little bit more, to pull back the curtain a little on the topic, to think a little more about it, give a better vocabulary and realize this is what's happening. For instance, if you've been angry for several days, much less longer than that, about something, the problem isn't anger, the problem is shame. Shame most often morphs into either anger or sadness because it's an unbearable emotion. We hate feeling shame. So sometimes they morph it instantly. When you say, he made me angry, actually he probably shamed you. He cut you off in traffic, which scared you and made you feel disrespected like you weren't there. And it's anger that comes out, but it's actually shame. And all kinds of things. For instance, forgive me, but our political leaders have become masters of the language of shame. They speak about each other, not about, I disagree with your ideas, but that you are a bad person. Both parties do this. It's become the language of our culture. And there's a reason why every study done right now says America's just mad as heck. All over the place. Well, it's what shame will do. It will make you angry. And so I've tried the last several years, especially in the blog, to tell people, calm down, calm down. I've even told people, for God's sakes, quit listening to political anything. Pull back from it. This is unhealthy. This is poisonous language. If you have an opinion, fine. If you want to vote, fine. If you don't want to vote, there's not your duty. There is no commandment in Scripture says you have to do this. You will not make the world turn out the way you want it to. That is not going to happen. But this other stuff is poisoning us and making us utterly subject to the passions. It's already bad enough. They market to your passions. Facebook, the ads, get your passions going. I like to go sometimes shopping for Ferraris and Maseratis. like on the web, because I'll get ads for them on Facebook. And that's kind of entertaining. It's so much better than the stuff I really want. And there's a couple of clothing outfits that absolutely have my number. I can't read anything without those ads coming up. But they know they do not want you to think, because thinking might mean you think something else. They want you to react emotionally. That's what's done in advertising. You do not want anybody to think. You want to mash the emotional button, because people make decisions primarily emotionally, not rationally. That's what they want you to do. And so that's how all that works. Why would you want to spend time with someone whose only desire is to poke you? And they do it. Why waste time with that? Don't do that. So I mean, for Lent, you know, quit making yourself crazy. Good question, Father. Sorry. Yes?
Father, what do you tell people who, while they're trying to pray, like I'm ADD, so I...
Me too. Can't you tell?
You know, thoughts and notice things and everything. Do you have any techniques?
I mean, people come to confession and they say, my mind wanders in liturgy, and I'm thinking, my mind wanders all the time. I've never done anything in my life without my mind wandering. That's how my mind is. I've got the thoughts of 5 men at any given moment in my head, you know, which is how I'm able to do this through my superpowers. And the Bishop of Alaska a few years ago said, where do you find time to write your blog? I said, oh, about 10 minutes every so often, all day long, in and out. It's just an ADD superpower. And, but I get all the other stuff done, but I'll write for 10 minutes, stop and do something else, but I can only do anything for 10 minutes. And then I got to do something else. This is actually just a useful way to waste time, apparently. But first off, there's some Sundays I start to go on the altar and I'm doing my prayers, and my mind's so noisy. It's just noisy. I'm thinking about something else. Somebody said something mean to me on Facebook or something like that. Or distracted by something. And I just stand there and I tell God, you know who I am, and you know what's going on inside me. And I wish I could just think only of you, but it's very noisy today. Just have mercy on me and grant me your grace. And to me, one of the nice things about liturgy is then I get to walk in the altar and do what I've got to do. For years, all my little boys in the altar called it my ADD holding pen. I mean, all those little boys out in the congregation, they need something to do, because there's nothing to do out there, and standing there, just kind of standing there, is just not cutting it for them. I know we've got children playing with toys on the floor, that's fine too, but at a certain age, I bring them into the altar, and gosh, they get to play with fire and wine and all kinds of stuff, and and I've got rules in the altar, and that is, you may not be angry in my altar. No anger in the altar. But anyway, and you just work with that and work with it and patient with them. And their little minds aren't doing anything my mind's not doing. I've just got more stuff to do. So with prayer, sometimes I have found a lot. I like to walk nowadays and do my prayers when I walk, because I need something to do. I've read some things that talk about just recent research that things that pass from the right to the left or the left to the right are very helpful as calming things. That kind of goes to different sides of your brain. It's kind of like crossing yourself. There's this action that does that. So physical actions can actually help a lot. If a mind's wandering, make a prostration. If you're like doing private prayer, make a prostration. It'll bring you kind of down to that. You'll do that. If nobody's looking at me, I might dance. Why not? When it comes to prayers, I'll just tell you, the single thing that really matters in prayer more than anything else is just giving thanks. The giving of thanks, I recently wrote and said that the giving of thanks is humility in the active voice. When we thank God, there is a kind of a humbling of the self in which we recognize that all things come from Him, and that we belong to Him, and it's all His, and so I give Him thanks. And that's the essential act of priesthood, is the offering of thanks. We stand at the altar and we give thanks. And it's also an offensive weapon. The devil hates thanksgiving. He can't bear the sound of it. If you keep it up enough, he'll leave you alone. My confessor taught me when I sin to get up and start giving God thanks. Oftentimes we do just the opposite. We sin and mope all day long, and we feel bad, and we beat ourselves up. Just get up. And there's a story of one of those desert monk stories of some monk who kept falling into the sin of self-abuse, and as they say. And every time he did it, though, he'd get back up to his feet and immediately start giving thanks to God. And eventually, like the demon got angry at him, a few years of that, and just said, "I'm leaving." And he said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I just can't seem to do anything, that will get you to quit giving thanks. I can't stand it anymore." Yeah, I like that story. There's some health in that. And so, so first off, do not beat yourself up. You've probably been beaten up enough over your ADD over the years. Everything from little notes in school, talks too much, My daughter brought one of those home from school, and I told her, I said, "Just do your best, darling. Someday someone will pay you to talk too much." And it's a gift. And they just don't know what to do with it in grammar school, Set them up in a little lecture series, Another question. Good question, though. I appreciate it. ADD power.
Father, have you read the new Dr. Peter Bertenic book, How to Be a Sinner?
Yeah, in fact, I got a blurb on the back.
We just started it in our book club.
Yeah.
We've read the introduction and the first chapter, and our first session was mostly just questions about what the heck are we getting ourselves into.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any...
It's a pretty gentle book and positive. It's helpful. It's certainly, Peter is really not just a hard figure. He's very gentle about these things. Yeah, I read it when it was in manuscript, and then he asked me what I'd write a blurb for the book jacket, so I'm on there somewhere, and feel so honored. But it's a good book, and I thought pretty solid how he approached it. Yeah. So, most of us would probably feel like I don't need to learn how to be a sinner. I'm already very good at it. Thank you. I think part of learning to be a sinner is, in fact, Stanley Hauerwas that I studied under at Duke said you have to teach people how to be sinners. And part of that is, America doesn't, we don't know how to lose. Losing is shameful. We know how to win, and so we're a big success country. America, I've had somebody say to me, "We never lost a war." And I'm thinking, I think we lost about the last 3. Last time I checked, Saigon is named Ho Chi Minh City. I think we lost that baby. And I'm sorry, but that's just how it works. America, the South, for instance, we lost the Civil War, but it was not until maybe 3 or 4 years ago that there was a single monument in the South to mark the end of slavery. It's like it never happened. And we honored our Confederate dead and our soldiers and stuff, although those statues didn't get put up until about 1900. We honored that, but it's like we never lost. We never lost. Hell no. Never lost. Forget. Yes, we used to see that all the time. Forget. Hell no. Kind of how that was. We don't lose. America doesn't lose. You need a national, you need a liturgy to lose, to help you bear the shame of losing. Forgiveness Sunday is a kind of liturgy in which we collectively recognize our brokenness and personalize it and say these things to each other. This is, Serbia's greatest saint, Saint Lazar, who was a czar, they honor him. An angel appeared to him before the Battle of Kosovo and gave him a choice that either he could win the battle and things would kind of be bad for his country, or he could lose the battle and the country would remain faithful to God. And it said he chose to lose. And that's their national hero. It's a story about loss, but about being faithful to God. It's kind of interesting. America doesn't have stories like that. It's like General Patton said, America hates a loser. We love winners and we can't abide a loser. So this is not natural to us. We don't lose very well, despite the fact that we're all losers. I've kind of told people, like on my blog, I specialize in writing to and for losers. You success people can go be evangelicals if you want to. But I'm writing for losers because I know the market's bigger. This is just who we are. And You know, like I said, I was in school and everybody wanted to succeed and be brilliant and be, you know, and belong and be popular, and nobody felt that they were. What a waste we had. We tortured each other with misery. And so now we come to Christ, and God loses and tells us the way of the cross is the way of life. Voluntarily gave himself up. So that needs to be, we say that, but that's why Sophronia will say the way of shame is the way of the Lord, who emptied himself, became obedient to death, even death on the cross, which is a shameful death. Study the text of Holy Week, by the way. Orthodox texts of Holy Week do not talk about pain. They don't talk about how awful it was to be nailed to the cross. It's all about shame, about the shame and the mocking. And that's actually what the Scripture is about. It's not talking about, oh, those nails must have really hurt. No, no, no. You know, it's that they shamed him. They spat on him. They mocked him. They arrayed him in purple robes. It is all about the shame. This is much, you know, first off, it hurts a lot more than nails. Much more. And this is as it says in Isaiah, I turn not my face from the spitting and the shame. This is how Christ came in among us. He became lowly. He became what we are, losers. He became what we are, that we might become what he is. What we need to understand is the kind of loser Jesus is. Jesus on the cross isn't just God kind of doing a cross act to fix us. Jesus on the cross is the revelation of God. As Paul says, the wisdom, word, and power of God is Christ crucified. That's who God is. It reveals God. And I always tell people, when you start trying to talk about the problem of evil, you usually are talking about the philosopher God. Go stand at the foot of the cross of the crucified Jesus and discuss the problem of evil there. It sounds very different. And Jesus is up there and in the midst of the shame, and you say to him, oh Lord, what about all the evil in the world? The guy by you is saying, oh Lord, if you're really God, why don't you come down? It's all the same, you know. Jesus is just, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. This is the voice of God. This is the revelation of God. Boy, we need to know this. We need to preach this, because the world is hungry to hear this. We got a world of broken people who have lost, who need to hear the unmitigated love of God that forgives them. This is the truth of our Orthodox faith, and that's the truth of our liturgy, even when it gives us some passages of hard language. So it's just saying what you were already saying. Yeah.
At the end of your quite wonderful book, Everywhere Present, you say, why are our enemies more important than God? They must be, else we would forgive them in accordance with his commandment. That whacked me pretty hard. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, enemies are tough, aren't they?
Yeah.
It really helps to understand that your enemy is you.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I don't mean that you're just the enemy, but my enemy is myself. I mean, people right now in America are just all about good guys, bad guys. Good guys wear blue and yellow. Bad guys, you know, whatever the color Russians are wearing now. I mean, you've just gone crazy with it. Crazy with it. My Facebook just blows up with this stuff. And I'm thinking, the Orthodox is very hard for us because these are our brothers. These are our brothers. I've learned to love them, both of them. And it's just awful. I told someone, this is like your uncle beating up your aunt. You love them both, and you wish he'd quit it. But, you know, you mostly wish everybody out there would shut up and quit talking about it because I feel terrible, you know. But it does us no good to pick out the enemy and shame them. Who do you think you are? You know, who do you think you are? First off, our last few wars were much worse. We killed many more people. In Iran, we killed 250,000 civilians. America did. And where were we? Quiet, crickets, singing big pro-America songs at our rallies and stuff, like it was all about 9/11, and every time the anniversary would roll around, someone would say, never forget. And I think, how many people do we have to kill for it to now forget? They killed, what, 3,000, 250,000, how many more in Afghanistan? It was just like, we don't even talk about ourselves, but you can project the stuff out to your scapegoats. Your enemy is yourself. You love your enemy like yourself. Because until we kind of realize this is me, this is like your son commits murder. How do you feel about him? One son kills the other son. I think Adam had that issue. How do you feel about him? How does Adam feel about Cain? Well, I guess just like he felt about him always. Feel broken, it hurt. That's, how do I pray for my enemy? Like he's my son. Like he's my son. Instead of using him as a screen to project my shame so I can hate it. It won't get healed that way. It won't get healed. Because this present war, for instance, is going to come to an end. I don't know how, I don't know when, and it's just awful. And the results of it, including, and especially including within Orthodoxy, are going to go on maybe even for centuries. Good golly, we're still talking about wars that happened a millennium ago. And Orthodox don't forget. That's not how we do it, I mean, I kind of look at it and think, what are they thinking? You want to hug these people. Do not send bombs if you want to hug them. They don't like that. They won't do that. I mean, it's just sort of, so as Christians, we pray for them. We pray for them. We are to be the mediators between God and man, to stand between them. And, one of the things is that I've got some pushback on this first time I talked about it, but it's very biblical, is pray for the sins of your enemy like they're your sins. You can take on the sins of a nation and pray. Jeremiah did. This is how you pray. And you go before God instead of like, this is my nation and this is me. You say, oh God, look at me. Look at my sins. Have mercy on us. And cry out to Him, knowing that you are united in the sins of your nation. They're doing it in your name. You're helping pay for it. It's yours. It's mine. And we pray for Him. Have mercy on us and deliver us from this. I mean, why is the Orthodox Church growing in America? I mean, I don't talk about the evangelism things and all those sociological things you can cite. Why is God having the Orthodox Church grow in America at this time in unusual ways, filling us with converts? I mean, I kind of think about it. It's because the American empire, like the Roman Empire, needs an Orthodox core in it to pray for it, to pray for it. And to pray for it not as immigrants and not as strangers, but as us and we. And this is a task for us, to pray and weep the way Americans won't weep, to weep for America. Let our icons weep, so that we'll be here and do that. And, and who knows how that plays out in the long term. That's God's problem. I mean, I don't know how providence works. I just think He's got us here for a reason, and that's a good one. I'm here to repent, so it's not very patriotic sounding, but it's actually, that's the true patriotism.